A jar of stout in a Dublin pub. It doesn't get any more Irish than this, does it? I've got a pint of Beamish alongside a dense, creamy pint of Guinness, which has got a reputation for being a meal in a glass. It's long been said to be medicinal. Sorry about the creepy Thomas the Tank Engine images. A Guinness a day keeps the doctor away. It will perk you up when you're tired. It gives you power. It's nourishing. But is it, though? Well, today I'm going to take this pint of Guinness home and test it. The Beamish, I'm going to drink. You see, I'm skeptical of this whole nourishing meal business. According to the Guinness website, one imperial pint of draft stout supplies 199 calories, which is noticeably less than regular old American Budweiser, a product often dismissed by beer enthusiasts as watery. And yet, an imperial pint of Bud supplies 232 calories, making it 15% more nourishing than draft Guinness. So I decided to check the specific gravity of several Guinness variants. I'll test 4 samples of stout. Draft Guinness on tap from a pub with the nitrogen carbon dioxide blend. Draft Guinness in a can with CO2 and the nitrogen widget. Guinness Original Extra Stout in a can with just CO2, and bottled Guinness Foreign Extra Stout, also with CO2 alone. Now, this video is long because I'm going to give you a thorough explanation of how and why this very low-calorie brew can seem so rich and creamy, along with historical background and brewing methods explaining how it's changed dramatically over the decades. But I'm betting most viewers want to see the demonstrations, so let's get into it straight away, shall we? Oh my God.
It's like a miracle.
First up, the pub sample of draft Guinness. This is 4.2% ABV. This version is dispensed with a blend of nitrogen and CO2 in a ratio of 75-25 as recommended by Guinness, or 80-20 as some pubs prefer. The gas and beer pass through a nozzle like this with fine perforations. Nitrogen is insoluble at atmospheric pressure and serving temperature, so it forms a very tight, dense mousse that lasts. The smaller the bubbles, the more surface tension they possess, relatively speaking, and this nitrogen bubble mousse is what creates the luxurious mouthfeel of draft Guinness Stout. The flavor of today's draft Guinness is quite estery, that is, fruity, a fairly typical Irish ale profile. This has changed noticeably over the years. The smoky flavors, high in Maillard compounds, and the lactic tang that made it special decades ago have been fading steadily and are now virtually undetectable. The company has clearly shifted to brewing a more modern, generic Irish ale, trying to appeal to as many people as possible, especially younger ones. I'm going to use one of my favorite coffee gizmos, the Hario V60, as a simple CO2 and nitrogen scrubber because gas bubbles clinging to the hydrometer can affect the reading. This will trap the foam, which can, of course, affect different beers differently, but we'll keep any of our errors consistent. The hydrometer is calibrated for 20 degrees Celsius, so that's the temperature of all the samples. Normally, I wouldn't fill the cylinder, I'd read at the concave meniscus, but that shows up poorly on camera, so I'm doing it this way with a convex meniscus for visual clarity. It doesn't matter if we're off by 1 or 2 thousandths. This is chiefly a comparison, so I only need to be consistent. The specific gravity of draft Guinness is below 1.01. I'll call it 1.008. So this nourishing meal in a glass is 0.8%, or 8/1000ths, denser than distilled water. It's in the range of American-style Pilsner like Bud. Texture-wise, once it's degassed, it's virtually indistinguishable from water on the palate. That nitrogen mousse is doing a hell of a lot of work, making this feel like double cream in your mouth. Ethanol is only about 80% as dense as water. A pure sample at 20 degrees would read around 0.79 on a hydrometer. So it certainly is possible for beer to be less dense than water if it contains very little dissolved solids and enough ethanol. But then no one's calling that type of beer a meal in a glass. I can tell you that Draught Guinness is a highly attenuated beer made from low-gravity wort with an attenuation probably in the high 80s. Don't worry if that makes no sense. I'll explain all of this later when I get into the details and background. But for now, let's move on to the next sample. Here I've got Draught Guinness in the nitrogen widget can. 4.2% ABV again. You can feel it's under considerable pressure. How does it work? Well, according to the internet, they drop an empty capsule into the can along with lightly carbonated beer and liquid nitrogen and crimp it. The LN2 will quickly evaporate and expand and pressurize the sealed can, which fills the widget with nitrogen and some beer under pressure. Later, when you crack the seal, the can depressurizes immediately, but the widget, which has only a very small opening, takes its time. The pressure difference, delta P, causes the widget contents to squirt out in a thin stream for a second or two, triggering bubble formation. Pour it in one go from a good height and at an angle to get it nice and moussey. And voila, it really looks like Draught Guinness. The head is really quite dense. And it's pretty much the same drink. Very similar flavor profile. Maybe slightly less flavor? I don't know. The difference is small enough to be a placebo effect. I'm not going to show the entire procedure again and again, so for the record, I take each sample from the fridge, scrub it using my makeshift method, and let it sit until it reaches 20 degrees. So here we have the widget. Pretty much what I expected. A very small hole for the pressurized beer so that it can kickstart the bubbles. It also explains why this can is a bit taller than the other. I'm going to call that 1.008, identical to the pub version. As I said, we could be off by 1 or 2/10 objectively because I want you to see this. The important thing is that we're consistent and we can be confident that these samples have the same final gravity. But tasting them side by side, pub sample on the left in the shorter glass, can on the right, now that they're degassed, I can't help feeling that the canned one is slightly less flavorful as I sensed earlier. And that is possible because the various dissolved solids that produce density might be present in different ratios. But again, this is a small enough difference, it could be a placebo effect. So both samples are very watery and therefore highly dependent on the nitrogen to create an illusion of density. Now this is the regular carbonated Guinness Extra Stout, and once again 4.2% ABV. You can feel that the can is under less pressure, as you'd expect since CO2 is a lot more soluble than nitrogen. The head isn't terribly strong. You see that it spills after rising only slightly proud of the glass. The flavor is slightly different. Less fruit, less aroma, maybe a bit more hop bitterness. Definitely some sharpness from the CO2. This tastes lighter on the palate than the other two samples, but I'll taste it again after scrubbing. Well, the gravity is different, 1.006, so it's less dense than the others, not by much. Tasting it after scrubbing supports that. It is a bit less flavorful, although it feels pretty much the same. And finally, the only thing labeled Guinness Stout that I actually drink, Foreign Extra Stout. This is heavily carbonated, more than the previous sample. And it's 7.5% ABV versus 4.2% previously. And it's 364 calories per pint versus 199 previously. The head is nearly as good as the nitrogen one. Look at how it stands clear of the glass without spilling. Just under the surface, it's actually creamy. And it lasts forever, proving that you don't need nitrogen if you're willing to use actual grain. The sturdy, dense foam tells us that the protein content is higher, meaning that by filtering this beer, separating the foam, I will reduce its density a bit. That's not a big deal. It's just something to keep in mind when we check the hydrometer. Looks like 1.014. This puts it in the range of strong bitter, alt beer, Scottish ale, and porter. If the coffee filter hadn't caught so much foam, hence proteins, this reading would be higher by 1 or 0.2%. So even though this degassed sample contains 56% more alcohol than the others, it still feels far denser on the palate. But it is still clearly an Irish ale. It's got strong hop bitterness without much hop character. I taste some lactic tartness, some smoky, roasty, toasty flavors, and considerable sweetness from unfermentable sugars, so we do need that bitterness. The ratio of fermentable to unfermentable sugars can be controlled simply by tweaking the mash conditions, or it could be a post-fermentation additive. The flavors are strong and assertive, but balanced. The texture is fairly heavy and smooth. You get some subtle warming from the alcohol, unless you drink it dead cold, which I would urge you not to do. If you find it too sharp, release some of the CO2 by pouring aggressively. Let the head fall, pour some more, do it again. It might take 3 or 4 to empty the bottle, but that will make it easier to drink if the CO2 sharpness is a bit challenging for you. This is a truly respectable beer. I like it best at around 18 to 20 degrees Celsius or 64 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit. The other 3 so-called stouts from Guinness, I'm not impressed. It's not just watery. The dry, toasty finish of years ago has been erased completely. It tastes like any mass-produced Irish ale. If you put Smithwick's Red on nitro, you wouldn't be able to tell it from Draught Guinness blindfolded, except maybe the Smithwick's would feel richer. So it's time to explain a few things and provide some historical context. Some of you might wonder what the gravity measurements that I took actually measure. Specific gravity is a measure of liquid density relative to pure water, which is given an arbitrary value of 1. Thus, a liquid with a specific gravity of 1.1 is 10% denser than water. One with a gravity of 0.50 is 50% as dense. One with a gravity of 0.90 is 90% as dense. Or, as we have seen, a gravity of 0.01 is 1% denser. 2 gravity measurements are used in brewing. Initial gravity, that is, the wort before fermentation, and final gravity, that is, beer after fermentation. Final gravity measures the wort's residual dissolved solids and represents what drinkers experience in the glass as a beer's body or mouthfeel after fermentation has run its course. I mentioned attenuation. That's the difference between initial gravity and final gravity. This difference roughly indicates the amount of dissolved solids consumed by the yeast during fermentation. Attenuation is usually expressed as a percentage. As I said, a wort with an initial gravity of 1.1 is 10% denser than water. If it reaches a final gravity of 1.05, it's 5% denser than water and has attenuated by 50%. If it reaches 1.025, it has attenuated by 75%, and so on. Greater attenuation produces drier, thinner beers, while lower attenuation produces sweeter, richer beers. Guinness Stout is recognized as an emblem of Irish tradition, even Irishness itself, even though its parent company, Diageo, is British. But it's Irish in one sense. It really is just a lot of cynical hot air and marketing shrewdness that people rarely question. Like the Arran jumper, an ancient Irish tradition reaching all the way back to the 1960s, literally invented as a make-work project for unemployed islanders and popularized by the Clancy brothers. Anyway, here is a partial history of Draught Guinness initial gravity. 1840, we're looking really strong here, 1.082, but it doesn't fall that much until after 1914, because the difference between 82 and 74 is not that huge. But now it drops in 1934 to 1.054, and after that, in 1950, to 1.038. Again, this is initial gravity. So, Draught Guinness once used a high-gravity wort made from real food, and they boiled it for a long time to concentrate it. They called it a meal in a glass, liquid bread, and that was true. From the 1840s through the 1920s, the original gravity was in the range of Doppelbock. In the 1930s, they started making a more profitable, medium gravity wort using less grain and probably a shorter boil time, both of which save money. This had an initial gravity of 1.054 and attenuation levels of 75% for a carbonated beer with a final gravity of approximately 1.014 to 1.016, exactly like today's foreign extra stout. It had a decent amount of dissolved solids and adequate richness and mouthfeel, although it wasn't luxurious like the old version. There was a big change from 1950 when initial gravity plummeted to a mere 1.038. Lower initial gravity meant that considerably less malt and less boiling would be needed, which made it extremely profitable. Unfortunately, a far higher degree of attenuation was required to maintain the expected 4 to 5% alcohol level. This produced stout with a final gravity around 1.007, which I showed you today. So the texture of 1950s Draught Guinness was like Coca-Cola, and drinkers were highly critical. But rather than return to higher gravity brewing, the company pursued a technological solution to address consumer dissatisfaction. In 1958, Guinness introduced nitrogen delivery, which gave its watery stout an illusion of density that the beer once legitimately possessed by virtue of its ingredient concentration. The technique was perfected in the early 1960s, just in time for the Clancy brothers to popularize it in America, along with the traditional Aaron Jump. Something else you might not know: Guinness uses extracts, like a kit beer. There are many such additives, but two important ones are MHG, mature high gravity extract, that's a strong pale ale with added lactic acid and no color, and RMX, roasted barley extract, that brings the color and used to bring that unique toasty flavor which Diego no longer deems desirable. There are RMX variants now called GFE or Guinness flavor extracts that contribute both flavor and color for various different products and different markets. The efficiency here is kind of sickening. They've figured out how to get away with the absolute minimum of inputs like ingredients and energy for boiling and personnel. In the 1930s, Guinness employed approximately 5,000 workers, making it Dublin's single largest employer at the time. But capital has since triumphed over labor. As early as 2008, Diego announced publicly that it would cut brewing staff at the main facility at St. James's Gate to a mere 65 souls. This can only be accomplished in a lights-out facility, where production, packaging, and fulfillment are almost entirely unmanned. The only skilled workers left are computer technicians, millwrights, and lab technicians. The company does little now beyond marketing, investor relations, and lobbying. Personally, I find it reprehensible. Well, that's about all for today. I've got several videos planned, some of them in the works, a few about coffee, a few about Ireland, and I haven't decided which one I'll post next. But I'm confident that you'll find it extremely interesting in any case. So, keep in touch. Cheers!
It's what beer drinkers drink when they're not drinking beer.